In this video, we're going to take a look at actually putting the layout of our send message activity together. It's going to be a pretty straightforward layout. It'll be a little bit less trivial than some of the other layouts we've worked with, but it will also give us another opportunity to perform different layout modifications based on the orientation of the device. I want the layout of this particular activity to change depending on if we're rotated, and we're not going to use qualifiers for that. We're not going to use resource qualifiers for that like we did with the login screen. Instead, what I'm going to do is we're going to do some modification to the layout inside of code. But anyway, I guess let's go ahead and get started. So basically, what I want to have here is a layout that looks like this. So we'll have our toolbar at the top, just like usual. We're gonna actually have buttons on this guy, and then we'll have our image. And why aren't you scrolling? There you go. We'll have our image, which will take up most of the screen there, and then we will have our message area with a kind of a background on it, and then at the bottom a choose recipient button. Now the send button is going to be in the toolbar. And now what's interesting about this is I also want it to slightly change if we're rotated. Instead of this, when we're rotated, I want this little panel here to float on the right-hand side of the screen. So yeah, I guess let's go ahead and get started with that. I'm in the send message activity right now, so I can simply control-click on the set content view r.layout activity send message. Now that I'm in here, we see what we started with already, where we have our let's go ahead and close that and open that so we have some vertical or horizontal space here. We see that we do have our image view already in place. So the next part that I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in a linear layout for my message items. So I'm going to put in a linear layout, and he's going to have a width of match parent and height of wrap content. So the default orientation that we're going to be considering is the landscape, or sorry, the portrait, like as you see right here. Now, for this linear layout, what I want to do is I want to give it an align parent bottom of true because we want it at the bottom. We want its width to not be match parent, but to be wrap content. And its height should be, or sorry, I was right the first time. I got width and height mixed up for a second. Whoops. Anyway, so width is match parent, height is wrap content, so it'll grow vertically but not horizontally. And then what else do we want here? I'm going to give it a padding of 16 device-independent pixels. We'll go ahead and give it an orientation of vertical and a background of random color, E37474F. So that'll be a nice little, the same color that you saw in that screenshot. It'll be a slightly transparent. We see that it's slightly transparent because of this EE component. That's the alpha component. And EE happens to be a fairly high number in hex. Anyway, so that's our background. And now, of course, I'm going to go ahead and give it an ID. And I'm giving it an ID because we need to be able to reference it in code to change its layout parameters if we're in a landscape. So I'll give it an ID of activity send message, and I'll call this options frame. Then inside of this, I'm going to give it an edit text with the width of match parent, a height of wrap content, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a single line of true and a margin bottom of 8 dp, and I'm going to give it a hint of message, and I'm going to give it an ID of activity send message message. So there's our nice little message guy down there. Maybe to make things a little bit more readable, we can change the text color to white. See if that makes a difference there. No, it really doesn't like that, does it? We'll also have to change the text hint color, so we'll change this to a very light gray. So AAA, I think, should be a good thing for that. Maybe even lower than that, 999. Anyway, so now we have our edit text. Now we need a button. So I'm going to do a button with a match parent and wrap content for our width and height. A text of, in this case, is going to be choose recipient. So choose recipient, and then we'll go ahead and give this guy, for this button, I'm going to give him a gravity of start and center vertical. So it looks like a nice little, or not a layout gravity, but a actual gravity for his text. So it appears left-centered right there. And we'll also go ahead and give him an ID. So I'll give an ID of activity, send message, and we'll just do recipient. All right, so this is basically our send message activity. So let's go ahead and open up our project, or our project window, and jump back into our send message activity. Or, well, I can leave this here up on the screen for just a second. And so the next step is I want it to change the layout slightly if we're rotated. So what's the best way to handle that? There's a couple ways to do it. The way that I'm going to do it is going to be just the quick and easy way. It's basically when the activity is created, it's going to detect the orientation. And if it's not in portrait, it'll go ahead and modify the layout parameters of this guy right here, of our options frame. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to jump in here onto the onEura create, and down here, the first thing I need to do is detect the orientation. So there's a couple ways to do this. The easiest way is going to be saying if get resources dot get configuration dot orientation does not equal configuration dot orientation. Now look what we have here. We have orientation landscape, portrait, and undefined. We're going to select, in this case, we're going to select portrait. So if we're not in portrait mode, assume we're in landscaped mode. Then I'm going to go ahead and say view options frame equals find view by ID r.id options frame. And then let's go ahead and change his layout parameters. So if you recall from earlier, the way we changed layout parameters of a view is we first acquire, or well, one of the ways is we first get their current layout parameters, we modify the layout parameters, and then we set them. But what layout parameters class do we need? There's a variety of layout parameter classes, and there's one per view group. And we have to see what view group does this linear layout live inside of. And if we look up, we can find that here at the root level element that it lives underneath a relative layout, or better yet, it lives directly underneath a relative layout. That means that the layout parameters we need to assign to it come from the relative layout view. So we'll go ahead and do relative layout dot layout parameters, so layout params. And in this case, I'm going to select the layout params class that comes from the Android widget relative layout class. And I'm going to call this params. And I'm going to say equals cast to relative layout dot layout params, because I know this view group is inside of a relative layout. And then I'm going to say options frame dot, and we're going to say get layout params. Then we're going to modify them. So what are we going to do? The first thing I'm going to do is say params add rule, and we're going to add a rule of relative layout dot align parent end. Now align parent end is going to shove it all the way to the right hand side of the screen, kind of. It's going to align our end with the parent end. And then I want to also go ahead and say params add rule. I want it to appear below the toolbar. So I'm going to say relative layout dot below, and I'm going to pass in r.id dot include toolbar. So it's going to be below the toolbar. And then I want to go ahead and change its width. So I'm going to say params.width. Now this is where things get interesting, because the width here in the layout params, like what we discussed earlier when we were changing the margin of a layout params, it's in pixels, as in real screen pixels, which is not what we want to define here. We want to use device-independent pixels. So we need to come up with a way to convert from screen or device-independent pixels back into screen pixels. That's actually pretty straightforward to do. I'm going to start off with a cast to int, because what I'm about to do will be a float, yet width is an int. I'm going to do typed value dot apply dimension, and then I'm going to pass in typed value dot, and then I'm going to pass in complex unit DIP. For the value, I'm going to pass in 300 for the width, and then I'm going to pass in get resources dot get display metrics for our display metrics parameter. So this code will then, I guess I can keep it on one line. This code is going to convert 300 device-independent pixels into screen pixels, which is the appropriate type of value for that particular variable. And now all we have left to do is say options frame dot set layout params. Set layout, whoa, really? Params. And we're going to pass in params. All right, with that all done, let's go ahead and launch this and see if it works with the rotation. So I'm going to right-click Send Message Activity and simply say Run. We won't get an image because we're running this activity directly, and the image is supposed to be a parcelable extra URI, but that's okay because we're not really testing the image in the background right now. We're just testing the rest of the functionality. So let's go ahead and launch that and wait a couple seconds for Gradle to figure out that I wanted it to have finished already. that. And what we should see is we see how it is already. So that's really cool. All right, so that all works. Our choose recipient button obviously doesn't do anything. Our Yura appears at the top. I should change the title. I'll change the title here in a sec. Most important thing, though, is what happens when we rotate. Check that out. So when we rotate, our options panel gets stuck to the right-hand side of the screen. So this would be great for if you needed additional room, additional vertical screen space. But anyway, that pretty much is what I wanted to do there. So let's go ahead and rotate this guy back into portrait. And yeah, so let's go ahead and move on to the action bar. And let's get that all set up. So the first thing I need to do with my action bar is set its title. So I'm going to do that. I could really do that anywhere. I kind of like doing that at the top, though, right after set content view. And it's important that you do this after set content view, otherwise it won't work properly. Because again, if you remember, set content view is what's responsible for setting the action bar to our toolbar. So what I want to do here is say get support action bar dot set title and send message. Alrighty. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and put together the... Well, I guess let's go ahead and really quickly add in that progress frame that we're going to need. We're going to need that progress frame for when we send the message. And I may have forgotten to actually write that in. So let's go back to activity send message. And all the way at the bottom here, I'm going to create a frame layout just like usual with the match parent, width and height. What do we want to give this guy? Let's give him a background of 2196F3, and let's give him a clickable to true. We don't want anybody clicking through this guy. And let's give him an ID of activity send message progress frame, and then inside of him I'm going to give him a progress bar of wrap content, and indeterminate only true with a layout gravity of center. Okay, so now what I want to do, because this progress frame is going to be filling up the entire activity, it's difficult to see behind it, I'm going to go ahead and set its visibility to gone inside of the layout itself. So it is invisible as of right now, just so that while we're working with this layout, we can still see the preview. Anyway, now that we have that, let's go ahead and, I guess, just get the fields out of the way, because there's only a couple fields that we're going to need here at the top. So the first field that I'm going to need is a messages.sendMessageRequest. Then I'm going to need a edit text to our message edit text. And then I'm going to need a button to our recipient button. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this recipient button. And after that, we definitely need our progress frame. So I'm going to go ahead and say private view progress frame. Now let's go ahead and I guess just finish out the onCreate method, because there's a couple things I need to implement here in my onCreate method. First of all, I need to be able to reload my send message request on the onCreate. So when the application, when this activity is stopped, it's going to save the request inside of its bundle, and that's why we made it parcelable to begin with. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say if if saved state does not equal null, then I'm going to say request equals, and in this case, saved state dot get parcelable, and pass in our for our string. We're gonna pass in. I believe I didn't create that private field. So the private field I want is going to be state_request. I haven't created that private field yet, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to just take that name, come up here to the top. Underneath my private fields, I'm going to write a private static final state request equals state request. And so this is how we're saving the request when our application gets restarted, or when our activity gets restarted. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say if request equals null. So it's interesting right here. I'm not putting an else here. I'm putting in if request equals null. And why am I doing that? Well, that's because savestate.getParsable might return null. So if request is still null or the saved state is null, then go ahead and run this code. And this code is just going to initialize a default request. So I'm going to say request equals new messages.sendMessageRequest. Then I'm going to go ahead and say request.setRecipient, and I'm going to set that to getIntent.getParcelable extra, and I'm going to pass in extra contact. So remember how, we'll have to cast this into user details, don't we? Because unfortunately, Java's type inference is fairly schizophrenic. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Seems that it will infer types on assignment expressions just fine, but not on method invocations. Anyway, so what we have here is we went ahead and instantiated our request, our default request, and then we're getting the intent and extracting the extra content or contact. Now, it's important to note that it's perfectly valid for this activity to be started without an extra contact in the parsable extras of the intent. But if that happens, this code is simply going to return null, which is a perfectly valid thing to set the recipient to. So this code doesn't need to handle the two conditions of whether or not the person who invoked this activity actually set a user details or not. But this feature is really cool because it allows somebody to, pre-fill in the recipient field before launching this activity. So now what I want to do is I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here, and I'm going to alias out all of my controls. I need my message edit text, my recipient button, and my progress frame. Progress frame is pretty simple. Just find view by ID, r.id, send message progress frame. Our recipient button is pretty straightforward. Cast a button, find view by ID, r.id, recipient button, or activity send message recipient. And then for our, what was the other one? Message edit text is cast to edit text, find view by ID, r.id, message underscore message. So it's going to be that guy right there. You can verify that these IDs are correct, by the way, by just control clicking on them. And it'll send you to the control that created that particular thing. So that's a really cool feature to make double check that you're setting your controls to the right IDs. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say progressFrame.setVisibilityViewGone. I know it already is set to view gone, but I prefer having it explicitly in the code that I want it gone, just in case a designer or someone might change the layout to something else. I just think it's a little bit more clear what my intent is when I do that. Then I'm going to say recipient button.setOnClickListener is this, which of course won't work yet because this class doesn't implement that interface yet. And then I'm going to go ahead and say update buttons, or update button in this case. Well, update button's fine. Okay, so for our set on click listener for the recipient button, I'm just going to put my keyboard cursor on the squigglies, hit Alt Enter, and say make send message activity implement on click listener. Hit Enter again, and then hit Enter one more time. Now, of course, that's going to go ahead and create our set this to implement on view on click listener at the top. And all the way at the bottom, it's going to give us our method override. Then I'm going to go ahead and change that to view. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and say if view equals recipient button, then I guess select recipient, which will be another method that we haven't made yet. So the select recipient and the update buttons method are kind of linked. Select recipient is going to launch our select contact activity, and then our update buttons is going to change the text of our choose recipient button to the currently selected recipient. So let's go ahead and let's implement update buttons first. That's a pretty straightforward one to do. I'm going to say private void update buttons. I'm going to say user details recipient equals request.getRecipient. Then we say if recipient does not equal null, then I'm going to say recipient button dot set text, and I'm going to set it to so if it doesn't equal null, we're going to say 2: plus recipient dot get display name. If it is null, I'm going to say recipient button dot set text. I'm going to change it to choose recipient. All right, let's go ahead and implement our select recipient. That's going to be a straightforward method. I'm going to say private void select recipient, and all he's going to do really is he's going to say start activity for result, and I'm going to pass in new intent, passing in this as the context, and then passing in select contact activity dot class, and then I'm going to pass in request underscore select recipient. which is another constant I haven't yet made. So select underscore select our. So this will be used to determine the on operation response. So before I implement the code that will handle the on activity result, I want to go ahead and make sure I create this constant. So I'm going to scroll all the way up to the top, and underneath my state request, I'm going to say private static final int, and then request select recipient, and we'll set it to 1. Doesn't really matter what it is as long as it's an arbitrarily chosen integer. Now let's scroll down back to the bottom. So now we're starting our select contact activity for a result, but I haven't yet written the code that handles for when that activity returns. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to add a new method, and I'm going to hit Alt Insert, override members, and I'm going to say on activity result. And for the on activity result, I'm going to default to returning, or whoops, not returning anything really. I'm going to go ahead and say if request code equals request select recipient and result code equals result OK, then I'm going to extract the recipient that was returned by this activity, which is pretty easy to do. I simply say user details selected contact equals data.getParcelable extra, and then pass in select contact activity dot result contact. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say request code dot set recipient selected contact, and then I'm going to say, of course, update buttons. So at this point, I should be able to select my recipient. So let's go ahead and hit play. Give it a couple seconds, I guess, to do its thing. So now what I should be able to do is I should be able to say choose recipient and check that out. My select contact guy appears. And after a couple seconds, my contacts come in. And if I select one, like contact 2, now see how the button says to contact 2. Let's select that again, and instead of selecting a contact, I'm going to send a new friend request to someone. So I'm going to pass in hey there, and this is going to return a list of users. Now remember, this is a hierarchy of screens here, because if I click this contact 7 and send contact request, what happens is that it finishes the add contact activity, then it finishes the select contact activity, and it propagates that user details all the way back to our send message activity. As you can see, it now says to contact 7. All right, I think that's all I wanted to do in this video. In the next video, we'll actually go ahead and put together our sending of the message itself. So we're going to throw an options menu in, and we're going to actually invoke the send message call. So we'll see you then.